For the past 3 years, I had swallowed their condescension, their undermining comments, their constant insistence that I was raising Sophie the wrong way. I had tolerated it all for the sake of keeping some semblance of family in my daughter's life, because Lucas would have wanted that. But tonight had changed everything. They had done the one thing I could never forgive, made my child feel abandoned, unsafe, and disposable. Carla called me back minutes later, her voice tight with barely contained fury. She was standing in the living room shaking. The poor thing had locked the door but was too afraid to even sit down. "Tina, she's terrified." My stomach twisted. I had known Sophie would be scared, but hearing it from someone else made it unbearable. "I'm staying with her until you get home," Carla assured me. "She's safe now." Safe. A word that should have never been in question. By the time I was discharged the next morning, my decision was made. I picked up Sophie from Carla's, hugged her tighter than I ever had before, and told her something I should have said years ago. "You never have to see Grandma and Grandpa again if you don't want to." Her teary nod told me everything I needed to know. When Margaret and Richard showed up at my house later that afternoon, all faux concern and forced smiles, I was ready. "How's our little girl?" Margaret asked, stepping inside as if nothing had happened. "Not your concern anymore," I said coldly. They both froze. "You left a 10-year-old alone at night after she told you she was scared. You don't get to brush that off. You don't get to tell me I'm overreacting. And you sure as hell don't get to see Sophie ever again." Margaret scoffed, Richard rolled his eyes, and the gaslighting began. "Oh, Tina, you always make such a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing?" My voice was ice. "You broke her trust. She cried herself to sleep wondering if you were ever coming back. You made my daughter feel unsafe in her own home." "Lucas would have never allowed this," Richard said, voice dripping with condescension. My anger sharpened into something lethal. "Lucas would have thrown you out himself if he saw what you did to our daughter." I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to steady. "You will not contact her again. If you do, I will file a restraining order so fast your heads will spin." "You can't cut us out of her life," Margaret shrieked. "I just did." I stepped back, gripping the door. "Now get off my porch." For the first time in years, I saw something in their faces I had never seen before: shock. They had spent so long treating me like the powerless widow who needed their presence in Sophie's life that it had never occurred to them that I could and would shut them out completely. They left in a storm of indignant huffs and whispered threats about lawyers, but I knew they had no legal ground to stand on. They had never pursued custody, never contributed financially, never done anything beyond criticizing my every decision. If they tried to fight me, they would lose. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie seemed lighter. The nightmares became less frequent. She smiled more. She no longer tensed when the phone rang, fearing it was them. And I finally, truly understood that keeping them in her life had never been for her. It had been out of guilt, out of obligation, out of some misplaced attempt to keep Lucas alive through them. But Lucas wasn't in them. He was in Sophie, and she deserved peace. Months later, I found the unopened birthday card they had sent Sophie, sitting forgotten on the counter. Without a second thought, I threw it in the trash. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sheer audacity of his words cutting through my exhaustion. "Everything you've done for me?" My voice was cold, steady. "You mean the judgment, the condescension? The way you've spent the past 3 years making me feel like I wasn't good enough for Lucas? Like I wasn't strong enough to raise Sophie? You didn't do this for me. You did it because it was convenient for you, until it wasn't." Richard sputtered, but I didn't give him a chance to argue. "You made your choice, and now you're going to live with the consequences. CPS will conduct their investigation, and I will ensure you never have unsupervised access to Sophie again." "You can't do that," he thundered. "We're her blood." "And Lucas was my husband," I snapped, "and you have disgraced his memory by making his daughter feel like a burden. Blood means nothing if it's poisoned." I ended the call, my hands trembling, but not with fear. This time, it was with finality. The next morning, Carla picked me up from the hospital and drove me home. The moment I stepped through the door, Sophie ran into my arms, her small body shaking as she clung to me. "You're safe, baby," I whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You never have to be afraid again." CPS followed up within days. The investigator took my statement, spoke to Sophie, and visited Richard and Margaret. The findings were clear. Their actions constituted neglect, and their behavior raised serious concerns about their judgment. A court order was issued, limiting their contact to supervised visits only, if Sophie even wanted to see them, which she didn't. Their outrage was predictable. Richard left angry voicemails. Margaret sobbed in messages about family bonds, but I didn't care. I had spent too long trying to keep a relationship intact for Lucas's sake, for Sophie's sake, but now I saw the truth. They had never respected me, never valued Sophie's needs above their own selfish desires. Weeks passed, and for the first time in years, our home felt lighter. Sophie no longer jumped at the sound of the phone. She stopped asking if she had to see Grandma and Grandpa for the holidays. One evening, as we cuddled on the couch watching her favorite movie, she looked up at me and whispered, "I feel safe now." That was all I needed to hear. Months later, I found an unopened birthday card from Margaret sitting at the bottom of a drawer. I considered opening it, but instead I tossed it in the trash without a second thought. Blood may have tied us together, but love, the kind that was constant, unwavering, and selfless, was what truly made a family, and I had finally learned to protect mine. I let out a slow breath, gripping my phone tightly as Margaret's words played in my ear, her voice thick with self-righteous indignation. Never done anything but love Sophie? Love wasn't abandoning a scared 10-year-old for the sake of a party. Love wasn't manipulating her into silence or using Lucas's memory as a weapon against his own daughter. My fingers hovered over the delete button before pressing it without hesitation. Whatever they had to say, I no longer cared. Sophie deserved better, and for the first time in years, I wasn't going to let guilt, obligation, or the weight of their disapproval keep me from doing what needed to be done. By the next morning, the full storm had arrived. Margaret and Richard had gone from defensive to aggressive, bombarding me with calls and texts. Margaret's messages swung wildly between condescension and outright threats. "You're overreacting, Tina. You're going to regret cutting us out. Lucas wouldn't want this." But it was Richard's text that finally sealed the decision I had already made. "We're talking to a lawyer. You can't keep us from our granddaughter." A bitter laugh escaped me. They wanted to fight for rights when they hadn't even fulfilled their responsibilities? Fine, let them try. That afternoon, I met with my own lawyer. I laid everything out: Sophie's anxiety, their history of undermining me, and most importantly, the documented evidence of their negligence. The CPS report, Carla's witness statement, even Sophie's own words about how they had left her alone before. My lawyer listened intently, then nodded. "They don't have a case," she said firmly. "Grandparents' rights typically only apply when a parent is withholding access without cause. You have plenty of cause, and if they push, we'll push back harder." Relief flooded me, but it was mixed with a deeper, more painful realization. I had spent years trying to keep peace with people who had no respect for me as a mother. I had allowed their criticism to make me question myself, to make me feel small, but not anymore. That evening I sat Sophie down again. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "Grandma and Grandpa might not be around for a while. I know that might be confusing, but I need you to know it's not your fault." She hesitated, then whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" My heart clenched. "No, baby, you did everything right. They made a mistake, a big one. And sometimes when people make big mistakes, they have to face the consequences." She nodded slowly, processing my words, then reached for my hand. "I don't think I want to see them right now," she admitted. "I still love them. But they scared me." I squeezed her hand. "And that's okay. You don't have to see them if you don't want to. No one gets to make you feel unsafe. Ever." That was the moment I knew I had made the right decision. A week later, Margaret finally stopped calling, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling anyone who would listen that I was a vindictive widow poisoning her child against her family. I didn't respond. Let them say whatever they wanted. I wasn't interested in defending myself anymore, because for the first time since losing Lucas, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. No more waiting for their approval. No more bending to their expectations. Just me, my daughter, and the peace of knowing that we were finally, truly safe. I took a slow breath, pressing my fingers to my temple as exhaustion weighed on me. Of course, they ran straight to Daniel, spinning themselves as the victims. I could already imagine Margaret's breathless sobs, painting herself as the loving grandmother cruelly denied access to her only grandchild. I steadied my voice before answering. "Lauren, they showed up at my house after I explicitly told them not to. They refused to leave, so I had no choice but to involve the police. A pause. Then cautiously, they said you called CPS on them. I didn't call CPS on them, I corrected sharply. I filed a report because they left my child alone twice. The state considers that neglect, and I have no obligation to cover for them. Lauren sighed. Tina, you know they love Sophie. They just didn't think it was a big deal. I clenched my jaw. That's the problem, Lauren. It was a big deal. Sophie was terrified. And instead of apologizing, they're threatening legal action. Do you understand how insane that is? Another long silence. Daniel wants to talk to you. Then he can call me himself, I said, and hung up. I set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. The old me, the one who spent years swallowing my pride and enduring their passive-aggressive barbs for the sake of keeping the peace, would have felt guilty, would have worried that I was overreacting. But not anymore, not after everything they'd done. That afternoon, Miss Reynolds from CPS arrived for the scheduled home visit. She was professional but kind, her sharp eyes scanning every detail of my house as she asked questions about Sophie's well-being. I answered honestly, recounting the full story, how I had trusted my in-laws, how they had abandoned her, and how they saw nothing wrong with it. Miss Reynolds nodded as she jotted down notes. You have documented everything well, which helps. Based on the facts, this is a clear-cut case of neglect. Do you believe they pose a continued risk to Sophie? I hesitated. I don't think they would physically hurt her, but emotionally, I swallowed hard. They undermine her, belittle her fears, and now they're trying to weaponize the legal system to force themselves into her life. That's not love. That's control. She nodded, setting her pen down. Given their response, I'd strongly recommend pursuing a no-contact order. If they're already threatening court action, it's best to establish clear legal boundaries before they escalate further. Boundaries, something I should have set years ago. The moment Miss Reynolds left, I called my lawyer. Within the hour, she had begun drafting a protective order against unwanted contact, citing the police report and CPS investigation as grounds. That night, as I tucked Sophie in, she wrapped her arms tightly around me. Mommy, she whispered. Yes, baby? Are Grandma and Grandpa going to take me away? I swallowed the lump in my throat, smoothing her hair. No, sweetheart. No one is taking you anywhere. You're safe. I promise. As I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, I knew I had made the right choice. They wanted a battle? They would get one. By the end of the week, the protective order was in place. Margaret and Richard were legally barred from contacting Sophie or me. I sent Daniel and Lauren one final message. If they continue trying to force their way into our lives, it will be settled in court. This is not up for debate. Their response was silence, and for the first time in years, my home, the home I built for Sophie and me, felt truly ours. Peaceful, safe, free. I studied Daniel through the crack in the door, my pulse steady but my patience worn thin. This was the brother-in-law who had stayed silent while his parents twisted the truth. The one who had been at that party while my daughter sat home alone, terrified. I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me. Talk, I said, arms crossed. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Look, I didn't know they left Sophie alone that night. Mom and Dad said she didn't want to come, so I assumed. You assumed wrong, I cut in, my voice cold. You assumed your parents wouldn't do something reckless. You assumed they wouldn't put their own wants above a child's safety. And now you're here, why? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Because I don't agree with what they're doing. The lawsuit, the public posts, it's too much. But they won't listen to me. I let out a bitter laugh. So you want me to fix it? No, he said quickly, shaking his head. I came to say I understand why you're doing what you're doing. And if this goes to court, I won't back them up. That stopped me short. You'd testify against them? He hesitated, then nodded. I'd tell the truth. They crossed a line and they refused to admit it. I thought you should know. I studied him for a moment, searching for deception, but found none. Maybe, just maybe, Daniel wasn't as blind to his parents' faults as I had thought. Thank you, I said, voice softer than before. But understand this. I will do whatever it takes to protect my daughter. And I don't forgive easily. I get that, he said, turning to leave. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I watched him walk away, then returned to the dinner table, where Sophie looked up at me expectantly. Was that Uncle Daniel? Yes, sweetheart. I sat down, squeezing her hand, just tying up some loose ends. 3 days later, Miss Reynolds from CPS called with the final report. "Your case is officially closed," she told me. "While this isn't a criminal matter, the record will reflect their neglect if any future concerns arise. And Tina, if they continue harassing you, we can escalate." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. But the battle wasn't over yet. The next morning, Monica filed a response to their grandparents' rights petition. It was short, factual, and devastating. It cited the CPS findings, included a sworn statement from Carla about retrieving Sophie that night, and ended with a warning. If the petition is not withdrawn immediately, the defendant will pursue damages for emotional distress and harassment. Less than a week later, their lawyer sent a terse email. "Richard and Margaret Miller are withdrawing their petition. No further action will be taken." I stared at the screen for a long moment, rereading the words. Just like that, it was over. No court battle, no drawn-out legal war, just a final, whimpering retreat. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Mommy? Yes, baby? Grandma and Grandpa aren't coming back, are they?" I brushed a curl from her forehead, pressing a kiss there. "Not unless they change, sweetheart. And I don't think they will." She nodded, curling into her blankets. "That's okay. I don't want to feel small anymore." My throat tightened. "You never have to, baby. Not ever again." And as I turned off the light and closed her door, I realized I didn't feel small anymore either. The battle had ended, but the scars it left behind would take time to fade. As I watched Sophie sit beside Richard on the park bench, animatedly explaining the features of her new tablet, I felt something shift, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. 3 months had passed since that tense meeting in my living room, where the lines between justice and family had blurred. The agreement had been signed, boundaries set, and conditions enforced. True to their word, Richard and Margaret had attended every grandparenting course, every family therapy session, though not without resistance. Margaret had initially approached the sessions as a mere formality, but over time, I saw the cracks forming in her rigid beliefs. Supervised visits had been awkward at first, filled with stiff conversations and long silences, but Sophie, with the pure heart of a child, had been the bridge. She held no grudges, only the desire to love and be loved, and that was something even Richard and Margaret couldn't ignore. Slowly, they began to listen more and lecture less, to ask about her interests instead of imposing their expectations. I wasn't naive enough to believe they had changed completely, but they had learned that love wasn't about control, that trust wasn't given freely but earned, and that Sophie's well-being came before their pride. Richard glanced up from the tablet, his gaze meeting mine. There was no hostility there, only quiet acceptance. I nodded once in acknowledgement. No words were needed. We weren't friends, and perhaps we never would be, but we had found common ground in the one thing that mattered, Sophie. Margaret sat nearby, watching from a distance, still cautious, still careful with her words around me. She had apologized once, not in grand gestures but in small actions, showing up on time, respecting the rules, making an effort to meet Sophie where she was rather than where they thought she should be. That was enough for now. As I sat on the bench, the warm breeze stirring the autumn leaves around us, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting to protect Sophie from them. I had been fighting to protect her from a cycle of guilt, manipulation, and unspoken wounds. But now, as she laughed and showed her grandfather something on the screen, I knew she would be okay. She would grow up knowing she was loved, not just by her mother, but by people who had learned, perhaps too late, but learned nonetheless, how to love her the right way. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still unwritten. And as I watched my daughter lead the way towards something resembling a new beginning, I knew I had already won the most important battle of all. The transformation had been slow, but it was real. Margaret sat nearby, actually listening as Sophie excitedly explained her favorite game, nodding in a way that showed she was making an effort to understand rather than dismiss. Across the playground, Daniel and Lauren's sons played on the swings, occasionally calling for Sophie to join them, a sight that would have seemed impossible just a few months ago. The family therapy sessions had been grueling at first, filled with defensiveness and unspoken resentment, but over time, they forced the necessary conversations, ones about boundaries, respect, and the deep wounds Lucas's death had left in all of us. The grandparenting classes had been an even greater wake-up call for Richard and Margaret. During our last session, Margaret, usually so rigid in her beliefs, had hesitated before admitting, "We raised our boys to be tough, to figure things out on their own." We thought we were doing the same for Sophie, but maybe we were wrong. Maybe the world is different now, and we need to be different too. The words had not come easily for her, but they were the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and for the first time I believed she meant them. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were still moments where their old patterns resurfaced, where Richard's stubbornness clashed with my insistence on structure, where Margaret's passive-aggressive comments tested my patience. But the difference now was that they were trying, truly trying to change, and for Sophie's sake, I was willing to meet them halfway. My phone buzzed with a message from Carla. "How's it going?" I smiled slightly as I typed back, "Better than expected. They're actually listening to her." Carla, who had been my rock through the darkest moments of this ordeal, knew how much weight those words carried. I had learned my lesson. Never again would I rely too heavily on any single person for support. Instead, I had built a network around Sophie. Carla, Daniel, and Lauren, my friend Monica, and a few other trusted adults who would always be there for her, no matter what. As I watched my daughter giggle at something Richard said, I felt something unexpected. Not the vindictive satisfaction I once thought I'd crave, but something quieter, something deeper. It was peace. The peace of knowing that I had protected my daughter without severing the connection to her father's family. The peace of realizing that true victory wasn't about destroying relationships, but reshaping them into something healthier. And in that moment, as the warm autumn breeze rustled through the trees and Sophie ran off to join her cousins, I knew I had won in the way that mattered most. As I sat there, watching Sophie interact with her grandparents in a way that felt natural rather than forced, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For months I had been bracing myself for the worst: legal battles, permanent estrangement, the loss of a family connection that, despite everything, still mattered to my daughter. But instead, here we were, in a place I never imagined we'd reach. It hadn't been easy, and there were still scars that couldn't be erased, but there was something stronger in its place. Understanding, however imperfect, and the cautious rebuilding of trust. Sophie's laughter rang out as she ran toward the swings, her long hair catching in the wind. Richard watched her go, a soft, almost wistful expression crossing his face. I caught it in a glance, the realization of everything he'd nearly lost, the weight of mistakes he couldn't take back. When he looked at me, it wasn't with the usual resistance or resentment, but something closer to gratitude, maybe even respect. "You did a good job raising her," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Lucas would be proud." For the first time, I didn't feel the usual sting of bitterness that accompanied any mention of Lucas's name from them. They had once used his memory as a weapon against me, twisting his absence into a justification for their control. But not this time. This time, Richard wasn't using Lucas against me, he was acknowledging the truth. I had raised Sophie, I had protected her, I had fought for her when no one else had. "I know," I said simply. Margaret, who had been sitting stiffly beside him, shifted uncomfortably. "We thought we were doing what was best," she murmured, her hands twisting in her lap. "We thought we were helping her be strong." I could have thrown her words back at her, pointed out how strength in their eyes had meant abandonment, how they had disregarded Sophie's fears and ignored my pleas to respect her needs. But I didn't. Because the truth was, in their own misguided way, they had believed they were helping. It didn't excuse their choices, but it explained them. And after everything, I had come to realize that understanding someone's reasons didn't mean excusing their actions. It simply meant deciding whether those reasons were enough to move forward. "I know you love her," I said after a pause. "But love isn't just about what you think is best. It's about listening. It's about making sure she feels safe, even when it's inconvenient for you." Margaret nodded, swallowing hard. "I see that now." There was no dramatic apology, no sweeping reconciliation, just those words, and the quiet acknowledgement that they were finally beginning to understand. And for now, that was enough. Sophie ran back toward us, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, can I go to Aunt Lauren's house for dinner?" she asked, already knowing my answer. I smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." She turned to Richard and Margaret. "Will you come too?" They both looked at me hesitantly, waiting for my reaction. The ball was in my court now. "Go ahead," I told them. "Just make sure you all listen to her." Richard nodded, and Margaret gave me a look that was softer than any she had given me in years. It wasn't quite approval, but maybe something better. Acceptance. As they walked toward their car, I stayed behind, watching them go. The road to this moment had been painful, full of betrayal, anger, and uncertainty. There had been nights I lay awake, wondering if I had done the right thing, if cutting them off completely would have been easier. But as I watched my daughter, her hand slipping into her grandfather's as they crossed the parking lot together, I knew I had made the right choice. The battle hadn't been about revenge. It had been about respect, about making sure they understood that love without accountability wasn't enough. And now, at last, they did. I turned my phone over in my hands, glancing at my lock screen, a photo of Sophie and me on a road trip last summer, her beaming smile filling the frame. This was the life I had built, the one I had fought to protect. And as I stood there in the late afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in years, I knew one thing for certain. We were finally free.